Hello everyone, this is Mr. Shields back again with another video. Today we actually have a new topic, the quadratic formula. And we see it listed here, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. So the quadratic formula itself, it's pretty easy because all we're going to be doing is substitution. So I'm going to do maybe 2 or 3 examples here. And then if you stick around for the second video, or second part of this video, I'll give you a little bit of some shortcuts or some hints on how to do the lesson activity that you're going to have. So in order to use the quadratic formula, you need a couple of things. First and foremost, you need a quadratic equation. And so I wrote it down here. You're probably going to want to write that down in your notes as well. So you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So in order to use the quadratic formula over here, you need to make sure that whatever problem you're given is actually in this format here. So if I take a look at the example here, x squared minus 5x minus 36, you'll notice I have an a, b, and a c, and everything is set equal to 0. So let's go ahead and start out with this problem. Now, the one thing I will say about the quadratic formula, whereas I think it's pretty straightforward, the really tricky part or the cumbersome part is the fact that you actually have to write out a lot of steps in order to get this done. So as a result, I'm going to go ahead and use a scratch sheet of paper to solve this problem. So the very first thing that you're going to need to do is identify your A, B, and C. Because if we're going to use the quadratic formula, we need those 3 things at the start. And so if I take a look at my A in this problem here, I'm going to see an imaginary 1. So I'm going to have A equals 1. Now, if I take a look at my B here, we'll notice here that I'm going to have a negative 5. Do not forget to include the sign. That makes all the difference in the world with these problems. And then lastly here, C equals, just looking above, also a negative number, this time a negative 36. Now, we're going to go ahead and plug it into our handy-dandy formula. And I actually wrote the formula and the quadratic equation on a note card. Feel free to do so now. I'll give you a second or two to jot that down. So once you have your A, B, and C, like I said, it's pretty straightforward. You're just plugging it into the formula here. So I'm going to move my card to the side here so that you can see it while I'm plugging it in. So I'm going to have x equals negative. Now you notice in the equation or the formula that I have a negative b. Now keep in mind, what I'm substituting in is a negative 5. So there are actually going to be 2 negative symbols here. So it's very important when you're substituting in these numbers to go ahead and use parentheses. And I have plus or minus b squared. And so my b squared in this case is just going to be a negative 5. And I'll put my little squared symbol here. Minus 4, parentheses a, so my a here is 1, c, and my c here happens to be a negative 36. All of that on top of 2 times a, so it'd be 2 times the 1 that is right here. Okay, so there's a lot going on as far as just breaking down the steps, but let's just go dive right into that here, shall we? So if I take a look at the numerator here, negative times negative, that's going to go ahead and give me a positive 5, so I can go ahead and change that. I'm still going to have my plus minus signs together here, and then I need to go ahead and start to simplify what's on the inside here. So in my calculator, I'm going to use that parentheses here. I'm going to have parentheses negative 5 squared, and that's just going to give me a positive 25. And then I can break down the other part here, and that's negative 4, parentheses 1, parentheses negative 36, and looks like I'm going to get a 144, so plus 144. Okay, so you're going to want to break it down in parts. I think that makes it a lot easier to deal with. Especially if you're not using a graphing calculator, you're really going to need to break it down in parts here instead of trying to do it all in one fell swoop. And then finally, 2 times 1 is just 2. So continuing to break this down here, I'm going to have 5 plus or minus, and then I can just add the two numbers that are under the radical sign, 25 and 144, and I would get 169, which some of you probably already can tell. That's perfect. So if I look at the 2, I'm going to bring that down here. And then we can simplify a little bit further here. So when I do that, I'm going to have 5 plus or minus whatever the square root of 169. Since it's a perfect square, square root of 169 is just 13 over 2. Now, the plus or minus, what are we going to do with that? Well, this is going to tell me I have to break it apart, okay? So when I do that, I'm going to have 5 plus 13 over 2. And then I'm going to have 5 minus 13 over 2. All right, and so when I do that, I'll get on top here, I'll get 18 over 2, which will give me 9. And then underneath here, it looks like I'm going to get a negative 8 over 2, and that would just reduce down to a negative 4. And so my final answer, x equals negative 4 and 9. Okay, and I can put a little squiggly brackets in here if I want to do it that way. Okay, so the thing about the quadratic formula, it really does involve substitution here, as you can tell, and it also is going to require you to have quite a bit of space in order to actually show your work. And so be sure that when you're submitting your classwork to me, there are only a handful of problems that I'm going to be assigning you. And so you're going to need to make sure that you show me all of your work here. If you don't, then you'll be getting an incomplete email from me. So be sure to do that. All right, so let's take a look at one or two more examples. I'll stop whenever I choose to stop, I guess. Like I said, there will be a part 2 of this video because I do want to give you some hints for the classwork. So if I take a look at my next example here, I have an x squared minus 8x equals 20. And so that one's an interesting one. I'm going to write it over here. Technically, that's our first problem here. So we'll have x squared minus 8x equals 20. Now, of course, you can't see that, so let me move it up. Now, what you should notice with this problem is this one's not quite ready to go. This one's going to need a little bit more work here, because if the quadratic equation, I need to have my ABCs and I need to have it set equal to 0. If I look at this example, it's set equal to 20. So that's not going to cut it for me. So what I'm going to need to do is move this 20 over to the left-hand side. How am I going to do that? Well, I have a positive 20. So if I do the inverse and subtract 20, what do you know? I now have them all over on the same side here. So for a few of these problems you're going to have to do on your classwork, you're going to need to move them over here. So as I move them over, now you'll see that I have a distinct A, B, and C, and that it's set equal to 0. And then I can just go ahead and plug it into my quadratic formula. And I'll do another example with you just so you can see the process once more. So as I mentioned before, you're going to want to identify your A equals, B equals, and your C equals. And so looking up top here, I'm going to have an imaginary 1 for my A. For my B here, looks like I'm going to have a negative 8. And then for my C, I'm going to have a negative 20. And then I can just go ahead and put it in the handy dandy formula. I'm actually going to write out the formula here on the paper just so I don't have to keep moving my card back and forth a little bit. That can be somewhat annoying for me. So let's just do it this way, okay? Now that I have my A, B, and C, all I need to do is just plug it in. So I'm going to have x equals negative, and looks like, again, I have a negative b. So I'm going to go ahead and put that negative 8 in parentheses, plus or minus the square root of b squared. And in this case, b is -8. So I'm going to have a -8 squared. Let's move this up a little bit. And then we'll have -4. In this case, our a is going to be 1, and our c is going to be a -20 here. So let's go ahead and break this down here. Why don't we? So negative times a negative here. So I'm going to have x equals 8 plus or minus. And so I'm going to want to take the square root of -8. So put that in parentheses. I have -8 squared. And then we'll have the 64 minus whatever the 4 times AC is going to be. So let me go ahead, put that in the handy dandy calculator, and then I'll have 1 and the square root of -20 here. And it looks like I'm going to have 80. Now, one thing that I noticed that I did not do, and some of you are probably cringing because you're thinking, Mr. Shields, you forgot about the 2 times a. Yes, I know. But I remember in time. Because if you notice, our a in this case is going to be a +1. And so I'm going to have my +1 here. Now, let's go ahead and break it down here. So once I do that, I'm going to have 8 plus or minus the square root of, and when I add those two up, I'm going to end up with a +144, okay? And then underneath, I'm going to have 2 times 1, which is just 2. And we can start to break this down a little bit further here. We're going to have 8 plus or minus whatever the square root of 144 is. In this case, it happens to be a perfect square, so that works out really well for us. So we'll have the 12, and then we'll have the 2 still at the bottom. And then we can go ahead and split it apart. And so I'll have 8 plus 12 over 2, and then I'll have 8 minus 12 over 2. And when I go ahead and do that, I'm going to have, what, 20 over 2. So it looks like x is going to equal 10 here. And if I look over here, looks like I'm going to have a -4. And so with that -4 divided by 2, I'm going to end up with a -2. And as you can tell, it does take a little bit of space once again. So I just did 2 problems and I ended up taking up most of the page on this here. So going back to my original sheet here, some of the problems, like the last example we did, you're going to actually have to move them over so they look in your ax squared plus bx plus c format. So here we had to subtract the 20 just to kind of reiterate that point. So let's make that -20 equals 20. Okay, and then we could go ahead and use the quadratic formula. If I look at number 2, again, it is not set equal to 0. And if it's not set equal to 0, then we have a little bit of a problem. So how would I do this one here? I'm not actually going to go through all the steps again for this particular one. What I will do is actually set it up for you so that you can see what it would look like. So I can't have it equal 12. So since it's a +12, I can do the opposite and subtract the 12. And then I'm going to have 2x squared plus 7x. And you'll notice I can actually combine these. So 3 minus 12, that's going to give me a -9 equals 0. Now I can actually go ahead and put it in that quadratic formula and get my 2 answers here. All right, so that's the end of part 1 as far as going over the quadratic formula here. I'm going to give you some hints and maybe another example in part 2.